never forget in my very early years of ministry, there was a man in our neighborhood, his mother-in-law was a church clerk of the church I pastored. And this guy on a Wednesday night, I was preparing for the service that night. I'd already planned a sermon, and God instantly spoke to me and said, don't preach that message. I want you to talk about Paul and the persecutions and the problems that he'd been through and how he was forgiven of that. How Paul had been so evil in his day, killed Christians. And I had no idea that guy shows up at church that night. He was an alcoholic. He shows up, a young man, he showed up at church that night, had a pair of white jeans on. We were in the clay hills of North Georgia. And I talked about Paul and what all he had done, how he killed Christians, but God graciously saved him, forgave him of all of that. The guy gets up, I give the altar invitation, the guy gets up, he walks down the aisle, he goes by his brother-in-law, takes him by the hand, walks out the side door of the church, and I don't know where they're going. Thinking, here's the altar, man, where you going? He goes around behind the church, kneels down with his white jeans on. I told that story one time, I talked about his white blue jeans. White blue jeans? Okay. Anyway, he goes around the back and he kneels down in the clay, the red clay with white jeans on, and was graciously forgiven. Little did I know, he told me later, he said, I knew I needed to go to church, but I felt like I couldn't be forgiven. I felt like I'd been too mean. Where have you been, friend? God has life for you, and God has abundant life for you. Do you hear me? If you're a Christian and you're struggling, I'm telling you, my dear friend, God has life for you, and God has abundant life for you. Now, when Paul writes the book of Romans, Paul by this time is obviously a Christian. You know the story of Paul in the book of Acts where he's on the road to Damascus and he's headed down, he's got orders in his hand to kill a few more Christians. And all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit hits him and strikes him off of the donkey. He falls off the donkey, and he falls there almost like he's dead. But the interesting thing, even though Paul had rejected Jesus and Paul had said no to Jesus, didn't want no part of Jesus, the very first words out of his mouth was, Lord, why did you kick against my shin bones? You kicked me in the shin bone. Paul immediately recognized Jesus. And of course, he becomes one of the greatest men of God of all times. And then Paul writes the book of the book of Romans, and in chapter 7, Paul talks about all of his problems and all of his frustrations in Romans chapter 7. Now, Romans chapter 7, I'm going to be honest with you, for years, that book that chapter really, it confused me. It just confused me. Paul talks about all the things that he wanted to do, but he couldn't do them. He said, and then I realized one day, Paul says, because there's another member warring inside of me. Now that member obviously is the flesh, but Paul also is dealing with another problem here, which is his major problem and that is that Paul, for all of his life, Paul has studied tradition. He studied the Jewish tradition. He studied the Old Testament. He knew the Old Testament from front to back. But Paul now is saved. He's come into the grace dispensation. He's come into the New Testament or the New Covenant, and everything is so different. But his teaching, his mind, is trying to draw him back in the old covenant, the old law, the old way. Rather than being saved by grace, the devil is trying to tell him, well, there's other ways to be saved. You got to go kill this fatted calf, and you got to offer this. You bring the sacrifice, and bring the bulls and the lambs and the turtle doves. And wouldn't that be a bloody mess in church? Aren't you glad you didn't have to bring a lamb to church and slaughter that lamb all over this altar? Y'all talking about the cleanup team, man. That would be a job, wouldn't it? Every service you go through that. So he's going back through the old traditions, and then in chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, I love the way, I've already quoted this, but I'm going to quote it again. Chapter 8 starts off, and it looks like he's seen the light. Now, there's therefore no condemnation